But so the word rib sticks, and that's unfortunate because if you're reading it literalistically, you will read the word rib and you think that the woman comes from the man, which again leads to this poor theology, this backward theology of male priority. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Whiskey in the Writings. I'm your host, Joe. And if you've ever read Genesis 2 and have wondered what in the world is God doing, performing surgery on the man, pulling out his rib and making a woman, and if you've ever wondered, does that actually support a hierarchy mentality towards men and women? Well, I got news for you. Maybe we're reading that story the wrong way. And today on Whiskey in the Writings, we're going to explore that popular, often misunderstood verse and see what meaning it has for us today. I'm so glad that you're here. And as we get started, we're going to talk about our whiskey. I am still working on some Old Forester here. This is one of my son-in-law's favorite. It's also one of my favorites. This is the 100 proof Old Forester. It's a very affordable bottle of whiskey, easy to get on the shelf, and is absolutely delicious. You know me, I like my 100 proof whiskeys. I like a little bit of bite out of it, but the Old Forester comes in strong, finishes smooth, and is just a really great sipping whiskey. And so that's what I've got in front of us because we're going to have a conversation that it's going to be, for some of you, maybe a little bit challenging. For others, it's going to be quite freeing. And wherever you're at on that radar, we need to sit back, relax, take our whiskey, a smooth glass of sipping whiskey, and have this conversation. Long overdue conversation in some circles. So whatever you have in front of you, cheers, pour your drink responsibly, and let's begin. Man, that's a good whiskey. Okay, so we're talking about a story that is very familiar to most people who grew up in a Christian household, familiar with the Bible stories. Maybe you heard this first in Sunday school. Maybe it was a sermon that was preached. And the reason why we're talking about this in particular is because I think this story, it gets really misunderstood for a lot of reasons. And the first time I was challenged to actually reread this story through a new lens was actually reading the work of John Walton. John Walton has done a series of books already just exploring the ancient Near East, the ancient world of Mesopotamia, and actually exploring the nuance of that world in relation to the world that these biblical texts were written in. And so it's a real helpful exploration. I'll link to the book that really opened up the door for this conversation for me in our show notes, but I encourage you to check out John Walton's work. He is a professor at Wheaton College and has done some extensive work on this conversation about, what did these stories mean to the audience that first heard them? And so what we often do with the text is that we read the text and then we begin to put our modern sensibilities on top of it. And we begin to frame these stories through our own perspectives and worldviews. And we run the risk, and I would say it's not entirely wrong to do. I think oftentimes we look at these stories in the Bible that we read and we ask the big questions of ourselves, like, what does this mean for me? And so people have been doing that since the very beginning of these stories. However, we run the risk when we do that of actually losing its original meaning and remaking its meaning in our own image. And that's something that we challenge quite a bit here on Whiskey in the Writings, is this notion of taking these stories and these texts and actually making them something that they were never meant to be. And so I want to open up the door to this conversation that begins in Genesis 2. But let me set the stage a little bit here. So in your Hebrew Bible, you have two creation stories. And these two creation stories are sometimes misunderstood in that we often think that Genesis 1 is the very beginning and Genesis 2 is a story that looks back on like day 6 and does a zoom in effect of telling you more details about what's happening in day 6. So if you were to read Genesis 1, it's very sequential. It's very ordered. It's days, 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 human, and then what's created. And I have had lots of conversations about this on this channel about what Genesis 1 is doing and what it's not doing. It's not a scientific book, but you can go back and look at those videos and see my thoughts on Genesis 1. But we often misunderstood Genesis 2 through the lens of, we think that Genesis 2 is doing a zoom in effect on one of the particular days that were described in Genesis 1 and telling us more information about that day. And if you're reading that story that way, I'm going to encourage you to think bigger about that. In fact, to actually reconsider that as an option altogether. So classically thinking, scholarship is actually pretty confident that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 reflect two different creation accounts, operating on two different levels, wrestling with two different questions, and providing context in regards to like who we are and what we're here to do in relation to other stories that were probably being told at that time. And something that I think is fascinating that I've actually been working through in my own recent research is the concept that Genesis 1 is actually a later creation story. It reflects the nuance and ideas of a God that is cosmic and over all things, that idea of a God is actually a late idea in human history, in the ancient world, as it were. And so most scholars, as I've been doing the research, and I'm not saying all scholars, because again, there is no consensus when it comes to scholarship. There's always someone that says, well, maybe not. But most that I have read agree that Genesis 1 is most likely a later creation story versus Genesis 2. Genesis 2 reflects an earlier creation story in how it's put together and the way that it talks about God. So this is kind of how it works, is that I mentioned this on our last video, this idea of the documentary hypothesis, which again is something that is a hypothesis of how the Pentateuch was formed and the voices and the people that wrote the stories. And so there is a tradition, and it varies in how that's evolved, because it originated in like the late 18th century, this documentary hypothesis. But so it's evolved since then. There's been more scholarship done on this idea, but the baseline is consistent, that there are multiple voices in this written text, people that either wrote down or passed down orally these traditions that we have. And the way that Genesis 2 is told reflects very much an earlier way that ancient people talked about gods. So in the ancient world, in the old ancient world, because it's all ancient to us, but like way, way back, when you're dealing with people groups that are ancient in the Mesopotamian area, the way that they talked about God was more about gods that ruled over areas, these patron gods. So every city would have its own kind of patron god, or every region would have its own patron god. And this god was their god of their area. And oftentimes these gods would go at war against each other through proxy of the people that would go at war with each other. And sometimes these other people groups would come in and conquer a land, and then they would make their god the god of that land. And so this was pretty normal. The gods in the ancient world were gods that were involved in human action and interaction. And so these gods were very earthy. They were very mixed in. There are creation stories of the gods that make humans out of like the blood and the dirt of battle and war and destruction, and gods that make they're very like tangible, hands-on types of deities, that they are involved in the affairs of humans. And so when you read Genesis 2 from a 30,000 foot view, you get these undertones. You get the kind of God that is actually in the dirt, in the dust of the earth, forming the humans, breathing life into them, very interacting type of a God. Genesis 3 reflects that as well, is that when God is walking in the garden, there's this connection to the God and the land. And that happens everywhere in the ancient world. And so when you look at Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 1 is reflecting a very cosmic God, a God who stands outside of the created order and speaks life into that from a place of cosmic kind of location. And what's interesting about that idea is that is a much later idea that gods were like that in the ancient world. And some have argued that that idea of a god being above all other gods doesn't even originate until the Persian Empire. When you get their god, Mazda, Aru, I think is, maybe might want to Google that, but their god, in the way that they worship, they were the first ones to begin to communicate that their god, Mazda, is a god above all other gods. That it's not to say that there are no other gods. This isn't monotheism. So don't mistake the Persians to a monotheistic outlook. They were more henotheistic, which is to say there are gods, but our God is the chief God. He is above all other lower, G gods. And that's kind of how that worked. And so some have argued that Genesis 1 reflects the concepts and ideas and the motifs that reflect a very Persian way of thinking about God. And so it kind of makes sense that some have proposed that Genesis 1 was written in this era as new ways of communicating God were being promoted. The Jewish people began to take on, the priests began to take on that language about God and formed Genesis 1 through that lens. Now, that's a lot. And I know that that's not the point of what we're talking about here, but I'm trying to set the stage that Genesis 2 is very old, and it's doing something through, through metaphor. It's tapping into ideas that are strange to us, because when we read Genesis 2, we often want to read it like it's a video cam recording of what took place. Like it's like someone was there and they're just writing it down as it's happening. And to be maybe most generous, people think that God said this to Moses as if God was going on Sinai. This is how a lot of times we think of these stories, like how did these stories come to be? And we picture Moses on Mount Sinai, and God is, he's 40 days and 40 nights, or 40 nights with God on Sinai. And during that time, as he's getting the law and he's getting these tablets written down, that God's sharing with Moses these stories. And so then Moses is like, oh, that's how it happened. Okay, so that's an idea. However, I think there's something else going on here. And so all that to say, when we get to Genesis 2, it's very old, and it's using motifs, ideas, and concepts that fit and align more with an ancient way of communicating how we got here and why we're here than a modern one. It is not a video cam footage. And so when we read Genesis 2, don't fall into the trap of reading it literalistically, which is a concept, an idea, a word to mean that as the words say what they are, it is what it means. That is a very literalistic way of reading the text. And I want to invite you to read the text, Genesis 2, literally. Okay? What's the difference? Literalistically means the words say the words and that's what they are, versus literally, which is honoring the tradition, the context, the framework by which the authors originally meant it to be heard and understood. So that being said, we're going to jump into Genesis chapter 2. We're actually going to jump around to a few different areas in the text to make this argument, because we're talking particularly on the idea of what's going on with the surgery that God performs. All right. So I did a huge setup, and maybe I'll chapter break that so I can make sure that we get to, those that want to get to the rib portion can skip ahead. But Genesis 2, there's a lot going on. It starts out with this God forming the humans, creating rivers and a garden, and places the human in, the Adam in the garden. And in this story, we are learning about what it means to be human. So I want to just kind of set that stage here, that this taken as a whole is reflecting the way that we ought to be humans, how we are to function as human beings towards one another. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the text as a whole to set up for us what I think is happening in verse 21, which is the whole surgery portion of the text. Okay. So here's my setup. Okay. So we know that God creates humans on day 6. So if we're reflecting back on Genesis 1, that God made humans, mankind. So God made mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. That's Genesis 1. So the setup of humanity is a creational male and female that are both equally made in God's image. It is not that the idea here isn't that God made a male singular human being and made that male singular human being in God's image and then made the woman, and the woman is almost like if Adam is the one, the woman is the 1B, right? Like this lesser form of image bearing goodness. Okay. That's not what the text says. It is an equal part human creation and human image bearing. And so from the get-go, if you're trying to make an argument about male priority in creation, Genesis is not the place where that argument is made well. And here's why, because immediately those of you that are wanting to promote a male priority distinction are going to bristle, because you're going, well, Joe, read Genesis 2 and you'll see that is the point. My argument is that it's not. And you can believe me or not believe me, but entertain me. Okay, whether or not, don't tune me out just yet. You can blast me in the comments if you want, but hear me out for a second. If I were just to present maybe a different way to see this, that might, in my opinion, be more faithful to what the story is actually inviting us into. Okay, so you have these two humans that are created. They're both made in the image of God. They're image bearers, and they are set upon the earth. Now, imagine a world where that male is struggling to understand how to function vocationally as an image bearer, and there is confusion. Okay, so we're painting a picture that the text doesn't inherently say, but I want to invite you into a narrative that I think better fits the story of Genesis 2 than a male priority way of reading the text. Because what happens is that God makes everything. There are no shrubs. There's nothing on the earth. Nothing's been cultivated. The land hasn't been worked. There's no rain, it says. God forms the man from the soil of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. And so we have this idea of this, and this is where we get like the male priority point of view, but that's not the end of the story. Okay. There's more to this story than that. So the Lord, he planted a vineyard, an orchard in the east. He called it Eden. And there he placed the man to work it. Okay. So you have this idea of vocational connection, that to think of this as simply about a priority of creation is an incorrect way to approach this text. This text is trying to invite us into the question of, what am I here to do? What is my vocation? What should I be doing with my life? Okay, so this is a narrative to explain vocational acts, because immediately after the man is created, he is placed in a garden to work it. There's a job to do. So out of the gate, the human is asked to do something. Now, think about this for a second. If you were to get a job, you get hired to do something, you are brought into the organization, you are onboarded into the organization, you're given a shirt that says the organization's name on the front, right? You are breathed into, you are empowered, endowed to do this job. The next question you're going to ask yourself is, how do I do that job well? You might already have an idea of how to do the job that you were hired to do, but that's only one part of employment. The other part of employment is, how do I do that job well, or in accordance to how the organization is set up to function and do the work it's there to do. So you following me? Think of this as like this is helping you understand what you're here to do. And not just simply who's here. So when you get brought into an organization, you are brought in as a person, but there are other persons there doing the job as well. You just don't know where you fit in that dynamic, in that work dynamic. You got to feel it out. You got to learn. You got to be trained a little bit on, this is how we use our tools and this is how we use our systems. And so this is the setup of what's happening here. It's not simply trying to, or at all, in my opinion, trying to communicate a priority of creation. It's trying to communicate what we do in creation. And this is the means by which the writer chooses to communicate it. And for me, I just think the helpful analogy is like, you get a job, right? You as a singular person are onboarded in, you are given the shirt, you're given the badge that gives you access. That's the breathing into, you are now fully in with us. And now let's put you at your desk, right? We'll put you in the garden. We're going to put you in the desk, and you're here to do work. So the question is, like, how do I do that work well? All right. So it moves right into this place where God looks at the human that has been placed in the garden to work it, and he says, it's not good for you to do this alone. So already the vocation that we are called to do cannot be completed without additional support. Additional support outside of God, which goes into a whole concept that we could work through about what does it mean for us to exist as humans and flourish. We can't be singular. We can't do it alone. So, okay. So that's the setup. So then God puts all of these animals in front of them to name them. And this is like a way for God, like, it's not as if God doesn't know what he's up to. All right. So it's not that it's like, well, let's see if this works. God's doing something to the man. It's not about God. It's about the man doesn't understand that he can't do it alone. And that's been men their entire existence, right? That this idea that we as men sometimes have this machoism that feels like, oh, I could do it. I don't need any help. And we live in this place, and it's as if, I wonder if the story is alluding to the reality of the fallacy that men often think that they're capable and don't need anyone's help. And God's going, oh, you think that's funny, huh? Okay, well, here's all these animals, right? It's not good for you to be alone. Here's all these animals, name them. And the man realizes, like, gosh, there's nothing here that matches. And God goes, yeah, I know. So that's verse 18. The Lord God said, it's not good for man to be alone, and shows him all the animals corresponding. It says verse 21, so the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. And while he was sleeping, he took part of the man's side and closed up the place with flesh. Okay, full stop. This is Genesis 2:21. What's happening here? All right, let's nerd out for a second. I think this is to build to my point that this verse is not about priority. It's not about hierarchy. This is about a vision for how you are to function as co-laborers, male and female, humanity working together to accomplish what God desires for this earth. And so you have this verse. So the Lord God caused the man to fall to a deep sleep. So here in the Hebrew, so the Lord Yehovah Elohim, right? So this is the personal name of God tied to the God. Elohim is just the word for God. So that's why you have the word Lord God. Yehovah Elohim caused the man to fall in a deep sleep. And that word deep sleep there is tardema. Tardema is the word deep sleep. Now that's a specific kind of word that has nuance. And so what we think when we read this in English is that God made the human, fall asleep, right? Like he's just taking a nap, and it's in this nap that God begins to perform the surgery. And we can run the risk of making the mistake that it's as if God is putting the man under anesthesia, right? To like a surgery, right? Like you put the mask on, you breathe in, you're out, they do the surgery, you wake up. That's not what's happening here, okay? So that word tardema is a word that always in the Bible is a word where there is a supernatural involvement. So i.e. a God is involved. It's a word that has nuance. And I want to connect this to another place in the Bible where that word is used, and it's used in Genesis chapter 15 with Abraham. And it's a moment in Abraham's life where God gives Abraham a vision. And so you have in verse 12, it says this: when the sun went down, Abram fell asleep, or Abram tardema, and great terror overwhelmed him. Then the Lord said to Abram, you know certain that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign country. And then it goes on to explain what's going on. So what's happening to Abram? Abram's just not taking a nap. God's giving him a vision explaining something. And I think that should clue us into what's happening here. Again, he's not being put under anesthesia to perform surgery. God's giving him, what I believe, a vision. Now, what's even more interesting, what supports this? Again, you agree or disagree with me. I'm just saying the word has nuance in its meaning. And in particular, I think what's interesting is that when you get to the Greek Septuagint, which is translating it's when the Jewish people in the late centuries after Alexander, when the Ptolemies were reigning in Egypt, they built a great and massive library, and they began to translate all the great literary works of the known world, the Library of Alexandria. And they brought in the Hebrew Bible, and they wanted it translated in Greek. Greek was becoming the more common language. It was what everybody spoke. It was a way to get access to the Hebrew Bible as the Hebrew language was beginning to die off. Greek was taking over, Aramaic, and so they needed a translation. So they translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. This isn't a Christian thing. This is a Jewish thing. The Jewish people took their own scriptures and translated it into Greek so people could read it. And when they use this verse in the Septuagint, if you read it, that Genesis 2:21, that deep sleep, that tardema, they translated that word into Greek as ecstasis or ecstasis. And that word, ecstasis, means trance. Like you go into a trance. It's where we get the English word ecstasy. Right? So it's like this deep trance that it's communicating. So that's the word they chose, the Jewish people, right or wrong, because in the Masoretic, in the earlier Hebrew, it is tardema. which can mean vision, right? That we saw in Genesis 15. But in the Greek, they choose a word that means trance, quite literally. And what's fascinating is that in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 15, or I'm sorry, Acts chapter 10, we get this crazy story that Luke tells us about Peter. And Peter, this is about the time when the question and the conversation about whether non-Jewish people can participate in the Jesus movement, what God is doing. And what happens is that in Acts chapter 10, Peter's invited to go to a Gentile's, a non-Jewish person's house to share the gospel. And this crazy story happens. It says, verse 9 in Acts chapter 10, about noon the next day, while they were on their way, they approached the city. Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became very hungry and wanted to eat. But while they were preparing the meal, a trance, this is what it says in English, a trance came over him. He saw heaven opened and an object, something like a large sheet descending, being let down to earth by its four corners. Okay, so I'll just stop there. You can go and read the whole thing in its context. We'll just stop there for a second. In Acts chapter 10, verse 10, the English that is used in some translations, this is the NET, uses the word trance, but it's the Greek. If you read it in Greek, it's ecstasis, it's ecstasia. It's ecstasy. It's the same word that's used in Genesis chapter 2, 21 in the Septuagint. Now, why do I say that? I say that is that there is precedence to not think of this word, this situation that the man finds himself in as a falling asleep type of situation or put in under anesthesia. There is precedence that what God is doing based in context, because what was he doing before? He was showing Adam all of the animals so he can see, is there a comparable mate, right? And so he doesn't change that. He just gives Adam a vision and he shows him something about this other creational good that's next to him. And so we get to this point. What is the vision? So this is how I want you to think of this verse, that God gives Adam a vision. So the Yehovah Elohim, maybe a different translation would be, so the Yehovah Elohim caused the Adam to have a vision or to fall into a trance. And what he sees in this trance is this next situation. While he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs. So this is where we get the surgery, right? And then closed up the place with flesh. Okay. You'll read in the rest in like verse 22 what the man does, or what God does. He forms the woman out of the rib. Okay. But let's just talk about that word. The word rib is Tsela. And that word is a particular word used throughout the Hebrew Bible, particularly and most frequently in the forming and the creation of the tabernacle, the house of God. So here we go. And when that word is used, Tsela, in relation to creating the tabernacle, in the instructions to create the tabernacle, it uses the reference that it's the side. It literally means the side of something. And so let me give you an example. This is back in Exodus chapter 25 we'll go to, and this is again the creation of the tabernacle. Let's go in verse 12. It says this in Exodus chapter 25 verse 12, you are to cast 4 gold rings for it and put them on its 4 feet with 2 rings on one Tsela and 2 rings on the other Tsela, on one side and the other side. In verse 14, it says this, and put the poles into the rings and at the Tselah's side of the ark in order to carry the ark with them. You get this in Exodus chapter 26, verse 20. It says it like this. I'll just turn right to it. In verse 20, it says, and for the second Tsela side of the tabernacle, the north Tsela side, 20 frames and under their 40 silver. So it goes in verse 26. You have it in chapter 27, chapter 30, over and over again. As the construction of the tabernacle is being explained, it uses the word side, on one side and the other side, on this side and this side, and that's the same word Tsela. So the argument is that this isn't a part of a human body. God is describing the side. It's a construction word to describe the other side of a complete piece of furniture or building. One side of the building, the other side of a building. Your house has one side and another side, and the two sides complete and make whole the entire house. And isn't it fascinating that this is all used in temple language, in tabernacle language? The house of God is built, and it's using the same language that in Genesis chapter 2, verse 21 says about the word rib is side. Okay, so why do we have the word rib? Well, that's a long story, and this video has been going long enough because I want to do my wrap up here. But just real quick, the word rib sits in a translation process. So Jerome, who translates from Greek and Hebrew into Latin, uses a word that gets picked up by other translators later, that then when it's moved into English in the 1611 King James Version, the word rib is there. And it just becomes a staple of how that word is used. I would argue this, we like what we are familiar with as people. And the reality is there are times that translators know that that's not exactly what the word's getting at, but to change that word might cause so much disruption that it's better just to leave a footnote about what that word means than to actually change it from rib to side. There are some translations that will translate it to side, but most actually keep rib. And I don't think that's because the translators think it's talking about a literal rib. I think it's just because the disruption it would cause to change it to side might be too much for the translation to work. And so they'll often just put a little footnote of like, oh, this word means side too. And so you'll see that in some footnotes. But so the word rib sticks, and that's unfortunate because if you're reading it literalistically, you will read the word rib and you think that the woman comes from the man, which again leads to this poor theology, this backward theology of male priority. And it's just a shame, because here's the thing. The reality is that this is, in the way that I think it's written, this is actually a challenge to the man to actually see the trueness of him being complete cannot be by himself. There is another side to him that completes his humanity. I would go as far as say this isn't simply talking about marriage. And I know you go, yeah, but at the end of chapter 2, there's this statement about the writer of this says, and this is why man leaves, this sort of thing. But if we reduce this text to simply talk about marriage, I think we miss the point of it. The point of this text in Genesis chapter 2, verse 21, is to show that the man is incomplete by himself, that there is another human next to him, the female, that is there to partner in the vocational act of bringing God's good on the earth. You can't do it alone. And it's not simply about like, well, your marriage partner. Yeah, that's like, the marriage is like a signpost to the reality of all creation. It's not because that can't be the case. We know that Jesus wasn't married. We know that Paul wasn't married. There are many people throughout the life of Christianity that never got married. So the idea can't be that the creational good is that you get married. That's ridiculous. The idea here isn't marriage. The idea here is that you are meant to partner with other humans to actually obtain and complete your human image-bearing vocation. So it's as if we go back to the analogy of like the workplace, it's as if you sit down and you're at your desk but you have a coworker next to you, and the two of you work together to accomplish a project under the name and under the influence of the organization you work for. You need each other. Okay, so my wrap up in this whole thing, we've gone a long time. My wrap up on this whole thing is that Genesis chapter 2, 21 has nothing to do with male priority in my opinion, in any usage of male hierarchy in relation to this verse to say, well, Genesis 2 says that man was created first, and so there's a priority of man, is a misuse and an abuse of the goodness of God, and has caused so much tragedy, hurt, and pain on our co-humans that it breaks God's heart. And I think we need to let go of this idea that men have a priority over women. Over and over again, we can point to the text. And I think the last argument is that some people will say, didn't Paul actually refer to this in one of his writings? My quick answer is that it seems like he does, but what if he's not? And what if he's actually quoting their fallacy of thinking back at, we're talking about Corinthians here, quoting their fallacy back at them. So there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. Let's start with what the text says and then work our way out of that, what it means for us today. And so I hope that this video has been helpful for you to maybe understand Genesis chapter 2, verse 21 through a new lens, a different lens, that maybe it's not talking about performing surgery, maybe it's not talking about male priority, but maybe actually it's inviting us into seeing that we are incapable, independent of another human being, to actually act out the vocation that God has invited us into. And once we begin to realize that the humans that are put on this earth with us are actually a gift from God. We have nothing to fear from them. And they're actually co-image bearers, the other side of the whole. Maybe we'll begin to treat a little different our other humans that are walking alongside us. At least that's the invitation, in my opinion, and the invitation that Jesus modeled when he was on this earth. So maybe that's helpful. If you have questions, put them in the comments. I'd love to hear some of them. If you're mean and attacking me, yeah, that's cool too. I probably won't respond to those. But if you have a genuine question, just ask, and I'd love to have more dialogue with you. I feel like I was talking so much, I forgot to have a drink. So that's okay. So as we wrap up, like, subscribe if that's your jam. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being a part of Whiskey in the Writings, and we'll see you on another episode. Cheers.